for those sixth graders that have come in. When I show you the topic, you'll be like, oh, great, this is, thank you for preaching on this topic of all the topics. And you guys can all thank Pastor Michael for that one because we assigned this at this time. But I'm going to go ahead and we're going to be continuing our series in 1 Corinthians 7, okay? And we've had a chance to talk about in the context of relationships, and this will be on marriage and singleness and sex, okay? So that's the topic of today. But what I want us to do is I want to make sure that there are a couple things that we're talking about here. And as we enter into the scriptures today, I want you to think of the fact that when it comes to relationships and when it comes to marriage, in this room today, some of you guys are already married, right? Married? Especially young ones? No? Yes? Married? Raise your hand. See, sounds like some of you guys, we need the sermon. Okay? Some of you guys want to be married? Want to be married? Raise your hand. Yeah, raise your hand. Yeah, it's okay. Want to be married? That's okay. You're already married, but I do not know what that means. I do not know what that means. Okay? Some of you guys are thinking about not even think about relationships. Raise your hand. Not even think about girls or boys and relationships. Raise your hand. Okay, some of the same people are raising their hand, all three. I don't understand what that means either. Okay? But I've been married for about almost 20 some years. Whoa. When you get married 20 some years, it will be 20 some years for you too. And it's not easy. And it's funny because the marriage is not a straight line. It has its ups and its downs. And you add into that things of life. Even if you had these other inputs, what I call kids, which affect your marriage, okay? When you have work, you have ministry, you have school. If it was just you and your spouse, wouldn't it be just so easy? But it still wouldn't be. Because life together is not a straight line. And so today, I'm going to share with you three main things, and I'll go through with it. And there's three main points that I'm going to make. That marriage is ministry, and that relationship with God's first. The second is that God's plan for your marriage is not always exactly what you plan. It's not a straight line. And the third thing is, how do you please your spouse? And those are the three things you're going to take away today. But in the context of the text, Paul is writing a very different thing. He's dealing with questions. First, questioning his leadership on who they should follow in Corinthians. It was a letter that he was responding to a bunch of questions. And one of the questions had to do with the cultural context. And in that cultural context, what do they deal with when it comes to relationships and marriage and sex? And how that works. And I think for us, I want us to be able to frame a little bit a different view, but I want to also give you the landing spot today. Is that okay? All right. So let me go ahead and read 1 Corinthians chapter 7. We're going to read this together. I'll try not to block it, but if you guys have your Bible, I would encourage you to open it right now. To open up your app. Yes, even you guys. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. If you don't have a phone, you're like, Dad, Mom, I need a phone because I got to open up the Bible. Okay, that's your answer. And if not, you can go ahead and we'll go ahead and read this together. Okay? Now, concerning the matters about which you wrote, because Paul got this letter about concerns. This was one of many concerns that he's trying to address. And here's the concern that they had. Is it good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman? And so there was a question that says, maybe with all that's going on in the culture today, maybe sex should be off the table. That's how we respond to the cultural context that in order to be spiritual, let's just not even talk about, let's not have anything to do with it. Okay, so this is what the question is, okay? So let me make sure. And this has partly been covered by Pastor Chien and Pastor Michael previous sermons, but I'm going to pull all together, okay? Then he says, but because of your temptation towards sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. In other words, one of the ways to deal with this question is marriage. You're like, what? Okay. But there's some cultural context here because marriage is not the same view that we have in our context. Because every social status doesn't have the same social status. Think about it, right? There are those who are slaves, those who are citizens, those who are magistrates. They're all different types of, and you have different dynamics. A slave couldn't be married. They don't have the option to. And so you have, and people married for different reasons. It wasn't only because of love, like today. It was economic. It was political. And for our time, what does that relate to our season? But he's dealing with a question. And for us, we will have our own questions. And that's why I kind of give us a starting point of where we land. And as we go through this journey, we recognize that there are always these questions when it comes to this relationships. Goes on and it says this. It says, the husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights. And likewise, the wife to her husband. In other words, my body is not my own. I should give release to allow for, in this context of oneness, to give them the rights to deal with this question, because sex should be in the context of relations in marriage, is what this Paul describes. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his body, but the wife does. So therefore, just don't deprive each other of this experience, okay, is another way of describing it. Except perhaps the only time that you want to cease from this idea of sex is perhaps during a limited time when we need to pray and devote ourselves to prayer. But after you're done, come together so that the reality is you may not be tempted by Satan because you guys lack self-control. Let me make sure you understand that. In other words, we all lack self-control. Do you understand that? Yeah. And if you pretend you don't, you are lying to yourself. And so here and now, you have to have a reality and a soberness to the subject. And be honest. Some of you guys are saying, my kids don't. No, you just have no idea. My parents, they don't know. You just don't realize. And here in this space, in this moment, is the beginning of, he's dealing with one question. How do we be more spiritual? What does spirituality look like? And so the people in Corinth, this city, a port city that's very rich, they're dealing with what is it that I have to, like, how do we deal with this circumstance? And so maybe their response is maybe we just don't deal with it at all. And then Paul says, no, you got to deal with it. And he gives one context in marriage. And the fact that you guys have self-control, there needs to be a reality of, in marriage, you're giving and taking, like there's a oneness, and we'll talk through that, okay? It continues on. I'm going to keep going, okay? I'm going to go a little faster now, and then we'll come to the text. It says, now, as a concession, not a command, not a command, but really kind of is. He says, I'm going to give a concession. I'm going to give a concession. I'm going to give you some thoughts, is another way of putting it. But since Paul, inspired by God, inspired by the Spirit, it's in the text, it becomes like a really important instruction. But in that context, and he's writing, he's like, let me just give some thoughts. I wish that all of you with myself, like I am. But each of you have your own gift. And when he says himself, he was single at that time. So I wish you were like myself, I was single. Some would say he was never married. Some say he was married. And most would think that because he was part of Sanhedrin, he was married, but his wife might have passed. So he does not have a wife at that time. But either way, at that very moment, he was single, okay? And so he was like, it would be great. It probably makes sense for you, as you and myself, that, that maybe you're like me. But each has their own gift from God, meaning Some of you might have certain things. Some of you guys might be married, some of you guys not. But for one kind or another. And to the unmarried, or the ones that are widows, I say it's good for them to remain single. And maybe he might be in either scenario. But either way, he says, it's good to remain single. Why? Because, as he is, but that they can exercise but if they cannot exercise self-control, then they should marry. Oh, here we go. So it's good to be single, and for most of us, we can't have self-control. So if you don't have self-control, it's better that you get married. Because if you don't get married, you're probably going to fall into temptation. That's the logic that Paul had in this context. Okay, don't worry, I'll translate it to our time today. But then he goes on and he says, but if they cannot exercise God, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. To the married one, I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. The wife should not separate from the husband. But if she does, she should remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not be divorced to the wife. In other words, in the midst of all that's going on, if you're dealing with stuff in your marriage, the ideal is not to separate. That's the ideal state. And I suggest that you don't. It's not for the Lord, but in reality, when he says this, I give it not I, but the Lord says that you should remain married and try to be reconciled to your husband at all times. So whatever the ups and the downs, the roller coasters of the 20-some years, you want to try to remain in that. But there are also circumstances that may not work out. We'll come to that. It says this, to the rest, I say, not I, not the Lord. And when he says this, I, not the Lord, it's in this unique context. It's not saying that, no, all this doesn't matter. It's like he has a question, like, when we have the Q&A sessions maybe at a retreat or a pastor, and then you're trying to answer them. There's truth in this. In this case, as is written in the text, it just means it really is truth, biblical truth. But at the time, as he writes the text, he's saying, this is my insight about the topic, about what you're dealing with. And so even in our time, we have the same topics when it comes to relationships. And it should be. I have questions about this. And it should be something we should ask questions about, even here and now in our context. Here, he describes this. He says, to the rest I say that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, so here's another context. What should we do if your wife is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him? He should not divorce her. Oh, but wouldn't it make more sense to divorce so I can be fully engrossed and focused on God? That could make sense, right? Because, this person is not married. I can be fully devoted to God. And Paul's guidance is don't. Stay married, okay? But he's also saying stay married to certain people. This is obviously the people that are more on the noble side, who have the option to marry. Then there's others who don't have the option to marry, or are maybe slaves or bondservants that came to know the Lord. What do you do with them? We'll come to that. And first he tells, but for the people that have the ability to marry and can marry, he says, why don't you, if one of them becomes, if you have an unbelieving spouse, you should try to stay with. Because if any woman has a husband who's an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, meaning he wants to stay, because even though he became a believer, she should not divorce him. You don't have to divorce him. But if for an unbelieving husband, if it's made whole, because the unbelieving husband somehow is blessed because of his wife. And the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. And there's something about the oneness in marriage, which we'll come back to, that there's a blessing that happens. Now, I know full well that we do say, and it's true, in our salvific faith, that each of you have to make your own decision to follow Jesus, to be saved. But there is a holiness, a sanctifying work that God begins to do in that discipleship journey in the context of others who are disciples. Okay? So let me make sure I clarify that. And as a matter of fact, he continues on even for the kids. What? Really? For the unbelieving husband is made holy, we talked about that, and the unbelieving wife is also made holy because of their husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but even as they are, they're holy. So the fact is not that you have salvific faith because you come from a Christian household, but there is some sort of unintended blessing in that context. And this came, actually, since Pastor Daniel's here from San Diego, this epiphany came one time from his mom. He was sharing with me the power of the fact there was such a joy when she came to visit and saw so many young people in this community. And then there's a blessing of generational peace. I'm like, what are you talking about? So something that we've been working on in our, because they're older, and that blessing that flows through, it's not that they're saved, but there's something about a holiness, a sanctifying work that God does in that context of a believer, one believing light and love in that household that tries to remain, to do that work in faithfulness. And in some senses, it gives us glimpses of how we do that in other aspects of life. Think about it, right? In workplaces, in homes. But you have to continue to shine light and love in that. But that's, again, a different topic for a different day. But the unbelieving partner separates, but if the unbelieving partner decides, I'm done, then let him go. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved because they're not slave. They just decide to go. They don't have to, they're not stuck. But God has called you to peace. In other words, you got to just let them go. You don't have to argue with it. You just got to let them go. Even though you don't want, it's not the ideal state. It's not the ideal journey. It's not a straight line. You want it to be a straight line, but sometimes you got to move and let it go. For how do you know, wife, whether you're saved your husband? How do you know, husband, whether you're saved your wife? In other words, it would be an ideal state that they just become a believer. It would be an ideal state that you remain married. But somehow, sometime, it doesn't always work out that way. Continues on. Only let the person lead a life of the Lord that's assigned to him. Oh, now we're talking about the slaves and the bondservants that, generally speaking, they may have come to salvific faith. And these bondservants don't have much choice. And as a matter of fact, a lot of women did not have much choice in that Greco-Roman society, right? It's not like they get to choose. It was very patriarchal. And in this context, you have now these bondservants that come to, well, what should you do? Well, you need to go ahead and you're assigned to whatever you've been called. This is my rule for the churches. Was anyone who were at that time already been circumcised, then let him not go ahead and seek to be circumcised. He's using it as an analogy. If anyone who has his call was uncircumcised, let him not go seek circumcision. You can't change your lot. You don't have to change your lot at that very moment. For neither the circumcision counts for anything or the uncircumcised, but keeping the commandments of God, meaning in whatever law in life, even if you happen to be a bondservant, you shouldn't try to get released so you can go get married or do all this stuff, and that's different. You just kind of can remain of what you're at and continue on in the faithfulness in the context that you're at. So if you become a believer in the context of married to an unbeliever and you become a believer, it's okay. You keep going. If you happen to be a slave, in this case, we don't got that, but if you happen to be a slave in this context and what should you do? Because they're asking, what should I do? Should I rebel against my master? What should I do? He says, just remain as your lot and try to continue to keep the commandments of God. Each of you should remain in the condition you were called. Were you a bond slave when you were called? Do you not concern? But if you gain your feeling, but you can go try to get your freedom, go get the opportunity. So if you have the chance to have freedom, go get your freedom. All right. For he who is called in the Lord as a bondservant is freeman in the Lord. Because deep down, even though you're a bondservant here on earth, you're freed in the Lord. But you might, in your lot of life, still remain as a bondservant. Likewise, he who is free is also a bondservant of Christ. So he's saying, you might be a free man, but actually you're a slave of Christ. So he's kind of giving you the context, right? And he's giving this whole different view and worldview on how you should see. So you might think this is the better than. And some of you might be in your marriages, this is better than. But it's not always the case to try to change that lot, he kind of gets at. That no matter what context you're at, how will you be faithful in that choice, in that context that you're at? All right. You were bought with a price. Do not become bondservants of men, is the bottom line. And it says, so brothers, whatever condition you were, you got to remain in that condition. Let me keep going, because there's a couple more, and then we'll come. Now, concerning to those who are married or betrothed, he got more says about marriage, to be married. He says, I have no commandment from the Lord, but I give you my judgment. I have more thoughts. But by the Lord's mercy, this is trustworthy. In other words, even though it's not like this is not my thoughts, this is trustworthy. In other words, this is very important. In other words, it probably is something deep down from, as we're in this context, it's from the Lord. It says, I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to be as he is. If you're bound to a wife, do not seek to be free. If you're free from a wife, do not seek a wife. If you do not marry, you have not sinned. If you've been betrothed, if a betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. In other words, keep in mind the question. The question is, should you just abstain from sexual relations? So then he begins to answer that question by saying this thing. He just says, at the end of the day, let's make sure we put the first thing first. Okay? And what's the first thing he's trying to get first? He's saying, it's not sinful to marry. It's not sinful not to be married. It's not sinful at all. It's not wrong. You could do either way. But yet those who marry will have a problem. They'll have worldly troubles. And I want to spare you with that. What's the sparing? Well, I mean, brothers and sisters, at a point in time, is the point of time when it comes to marriage is very short. In other words, there is no marriage in heaven. And so the time that you're married is only an earthly activity. So let me make sure you understand the context. For now on, those who have wives live as those who had not. So you should make sure that you know who's priority. And those who mourn as those they were not mourning, and those who rejoice as those who are rejoicing, and those who buy as that they have no goods. In other words, he's saying, recognize that your relationship of all types, the most important one is God himself through Jesus Christ. That's the primary. And if you've forgotten that, then it doesn't matter if you're abstaining from sexual relations. That's the most important. Let me give you the most important perspective for those who follow. That those who deal with the worldly stuff, even if you're married, even if, as the world says, the most important thing is to stay single, or the most important thing is to be married, that's all noise. Because what the most important thing is your relationship with Jesus Christ. And that becomes priority number one. And for the present time, this world is passing away. But he also wants to say, I want you to be free from these anxieties. To the unmarried man, he's anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But for the married man, they have to figure out how to please their spouse. And their interests are divided because their goal when they follow is to please spouse. And how can you be truly holy? And, I don't want you to be divided by the worldly things of pleasing husband or pleasing spouse. I say this to your own benefit, not to lay a restraint on you, so you have not a divided attention. And Pastor Chien spoke on this. But it's like this idea of like pleasing your spouse is what you have to focus on. It's an earthly activity to please your spouse, but it is something you're called to go do. And it says, if anyone thinks that he is not behaving properly towards their spouse, if his passions are strong, and it has to be because there's passions here, let him do it as he wishes. Let them marry. So if you can't control yourself, your sexual uncontrollable desires, then you should get married and do not sin. For those who are maybe engaged or betrothed. But whoever is firmly established, this is to the engaged people, in his heart, being under no necessity, having they can put that under control, their sexual desires, then they in their heart should keep her as their betrothed and will do well. It's okay to marry. There's nothing wrong with that. So that he who marries the betrothed does well, and if you choose not to marry the one you're engaged to, he does even better. Either way, however you decide, just remember the priority is God. And you can't go wrong. And the wife is bound to the husband as long as he lives. There's another piece here. But if her husband dies, he's free to marry whoever she wishes, only in the Lord. And yet, to my judgment, she's happier if she remains as she is. And I think, too, to have the Spirit of God. Okay. With all that being said, there is a lot that's covered. So I'm pretty sure Pastor Michael didn't expect me to cover the whole passage. But it was hard not to. Because what I wanted to give you a flavor of was there was a condition on the ground that informed their worldview that Paul was dealing with. And that some of it comes forward today and some of it doesn't. Okay? And then what is the conditions that make us inform our worldview? How do we view marriage, singleness, and sex? And as I said earlier, there are different types of different roles and different positions in Roman society that give you certain rights. Not everyone had the right to marry. And so for us, we have this freedom where we mimic certain things. We mimic very Roman culture when the Roman Catholic Church took over. We have, the way they did the marriage for those who are allowed to marry, they would put a wrap around this ribbon on, and they would have a cake and flowers. Sound familiar? And so a lot of our weddings are mimicked after this Greco-Roman context. But for other cultures, there's different types of ways that marriage works itself out. And so how does that work? And if you were a bond slave, those who are there are a culture of temple prostitution, temple worship. So sexual relations were all over the place. And as a matter of fact, it was the patriarchs or men who would demonstrate over. Sex wasn't a matter of heterosexual or homosexual. It was a decision of power. And you demonstrate that power in that way. Okay, and I don't want to go through the whole, but in that, there was choices. And the women didn't always have a choice, and even the slaves didn't even have a choice. Because let's say if you were a slave and two slaves, at any time, there's no necessarily marriage, but let's say if they got together and had relations, a master could take them away at any time. So their lot in their view of marriage and what Paul was trying to address in the question from Corinth in this port city was very different. What would be the question that that we would have to ask in our time, in our place, that we have to carry forward? And in this matrimonium, this different types of marriage, like you said, they have this glimpse where they would gather together, but it was only limited to those who have means or who have noble citizenship. And so it was even a common practice, even here and now, where where marriage became a opportunity to accumulate wealth, right? You marry with another family so you can accumulate power and wealth. And that was a cultural dynamic in that time. It's this change of status. But there was confusion in Church of Corinth because what do you do with this when you became a believer? How do you be informed as a follower of Jesus Christ? What does that look like? And even in our time, we live in a time that has a different view of different view of promiscuity and worship and access to sex and access to things in our time. Gen Z dating statistics have a different view. I don't know if you guys know this, but there's a different changing view of marriage. And so I asked you, how many of you guys want to get married? You're like, I don't know about this. I don't know if I feel like I want to get married. So some of us, we come from a different view. And remember, when your parents or your parents' parents may have a different view of how you should look at marriage and dating. And they give you their advice. And you're like, man, that's so old school. And the advice you're now giving to your kids is so old school. They don't want to hear your advice. Okay? And there's different contexts to that. But the reality is, glorify God in this context. What does it mean to do that in marriage, even in the context that we're at? What does that mean? Because I don't know, but teens today, do you not know that actually they think it's worse? They were doing a study. It's worse, it's immoral, more immoral to not recycle than to have sex. I was reading this like that. I was like, really? Because, you want to save the earth, but this is norm. And in the context of the Greco-Roman, it was norm that you would have relations with multiple people. You would have maybe a spouse economically, and then you would have relations with anyone you want to have relations with, especially those in power. Get it? Okay. So there are some takeaways, though, from the text that relates to us. Okay? There's some takeaways. Number one, I think you got to recognize that it's overwhelming. First message I would say is sexual desires are normal. It's God-given. So it's not to be something that's not God-given. So Paul, as he's writing the text, he didn't say, you're right, refrain from any relations. Now, don't get me wrong, there are others who have interpreted that text, monks, nuns, where they say, we're going to interpret it that way, where that is the answer. Paul specifically answers in a different way. Yeah, it is better to remain single, but if you choose not to remain single, if you don't have the ability to have self-control and remain single, then you should marry. So those of us here who have chosen to get married, it's because you guys got no self-control. Okay, congratulations. Now you guys can admit it, embrace it, be honest about it. Congratulations. Okay. For those of you who are still single, You can decide if you have self-control or not and decide to remain single or not. If you're not, then it's probably time to get married, or it's okay to get married. That's what the text says, right? It's like a fire. How do you play with fire? Oh, because you could just play with it and it doesn't burn you. And it's so soft and like a labubu. Okay, you guys know what I'm saying? It's not a labubu. It's a labubu that bites you, okay? With the teeth, all 10 of them, or 9 teeth. 9. 10 if it's a lafufu, okay? And so the passage describes your temptation. Each have his own wife. That's an answer. And as a matter of fact, don't deprive each other because it's overwhelming. The reality is that that it is overwhelming for you. So you, as your spouses, you should not deprive each other of that, because the reality of it is that if you're going through, in the ups and downs of marriage, one of the most wise things that one older married couple said is that if you guys are going through difficult times, go have relations. Because it forces, it's go pray together. Those two are very powerful. Why? Because prayer is very intimate. And relations, I guess, is intimate too. Okay? You guys get it? Because they're both open and transparent. And it's very hard. And it forces you to come back to oneness in prayer. There's a oneness that happens. All right, we'll come back to that. And the reality then also becomes, it says, if anyone thinks they're not behaving properly, let them marry. But it firmly established they can keep their desires under control with his own heart. We talked about this idea of this is how you quench fire. The marriage helps understand that if you decide to deprive each other of it, then it is easier for the man or the woman to go find that craving elsewhere. And they will. I've talked to a lot of guys, talked to a lot of gals, whether they admit it or not, part of that is part of that admission or confession. And that's where that conversation needs to happen, an open and honest one, and through the ups and downs. The other piece is that marriage, another guiding thought is that marriage is a 1 + 1 = 1. There's a oneness that means that our bodies are not for each other. And in that oneness, it says that it's for one another. And the passage describes that to the point where, as Pastor Michael shared in one of his sermons, you don't deprive each other because you guys have already given the body and the rights for that. That's how Paul views it in the context of marriage. I've given my body yours. You own my body. That. Now, let me caveat that to say that I understand there are some who may have dealt with other hurts or abuse or pain. That's a different discussion. I'm not dealing with that today. But I want to acknowledge that concern. That's not out of love. That's not out of this context. But there is a aspect in answering the question about sexual relations and answering the question about oneness. And that oneness is supposed to be in godly sense, in a loving oneness, in a holistic oneness. That's where it comes from. That the husband and the wife doesn't have authority over their body. There's a oneness in that. Because sex becomes a gift from God that's meant to be expressed in marriage. And that we learned a few weeks ago that physical oneness is one of those things where there's wholeness in that oneness. That sex is a way to say to someone that we belong exclusively and completely to them, as Thomas Keller says. And that there's a vulnerability and a nakedness. But the reality is, I actually think, when you guys think, the reality is in your mind, there are a few things that happen in your mind when you start thinking. What do you think about? Oh, you guys are like, what am I going to eat for LSL today? It's an appetite. Do you know how, and some of you guys feel like I want to eat here, and I want to feel like I want to eat there. I want to eat this, I want to eat that. And some of you guys are hungrier than others. And I actually describe this idea of desire as something like an appetite. Some of you guys eat a lot. Some of you guys eat less. But you can also starve each other, especially married couples. And so you have to understand that there's an appetite and a flavor. I don't want to go into too much details, but you guys get my point, okay? And the idea is that in the same way, there's a glimpse of what is being described. It's a blessing to be expressed in the context of marriage, okay? Marriage is called by God in a certain way. The other thing we're learning about marriage is that marriage is a calling by God to serve and please one another. Another sinner that when you don't want to. Anyone been a waiter I love waiters here. Everyone wait. Yeah, you guys waited tables before. You know, every single table is awesome, right? They're so nice. They never complain. Everyone's like, no, no, no. Just like your spouse never complains to you. They're so beautiful and perfect in every way. And the reality is that sometimes there are ways to serve your spouse. Some it could be relational, but in general, there's a view where you serve your spouse when the call is to please your spouse. Remember, like, even though Paul says that's a world activity, it is a calling of ministry. To obey God is to, if you're married, you must please your spouse. To serve God and honor Him is to say, how do I please you? How do I serve you? That's even as an important part of the ministry work that you do on earth. Really? Yeah. Because, there's certain ministry we do, like, I don't need worship leaders in that day because God's going to be right there in heaven, just like, God's going to be right there. You're just going to worship. We don't need you guys. You don't need the certain, you know what I'm saying? Like, just like in marriage, right now, won't be there in that day, but right here now, you're supposed to serve each other. It's a glimpse on earth as it is in heaven. And this idea is like, the married man is anxious about the world, but there are things to please their wife, and the husband the same way to please her husband. There is an aspect of that. Yes, some of it's in the idea of intimacy, but that's not the only thing. It's in general this guiding piece. It's the same thing that Paul will write, is like, for us who follow Jesus, to place Jesus first, find out what pleases the Lord. So there is an aspect of living out our faith to please God, and if you are married, to please your spouse, and to find ways to please your spouse. And so those of us who are dating, that was the habit that I was building when I was in the dating single season. If I'm going to date, how do I learn this and try to please? But you're not married yet, so make sure you understand the difference and distinction, because you can't act like you're married yet either. Okay? Because you're just beginning the process, right, of testing it out, if you guys are going to do in our time dating, which we could talk about another day. And the idea is you get glimpses of that. Because reality is, for most of us, we have three different aspects. The idea of intimacy, which is a close thing when you like someone, idea of commitment, and the idea of passion. A lot of us land at the commitment when you're married. But you have to understand, if you want this true consummate love, having intimacy, right, having intimacy and commitment is something, intimacy and commitment is this idea of liking. This idea of intimacy and commitment, it's companionship. If you only have passion in your relationship, it's like this, like, I just like you for how you look. Or maybe all you have in your marriage right now is just a commitment and it's empty. Or maybe you have the intimacy and passion, it's romantic, but you don't have any commitment. Or some of you guys have commitment and passion, you just like, there's passion, I'm committed to you, but I'm not close to you. But the idea of a consummate love, which is being described by Steinberg's three components of love, this idea of intimacy, commitment / decision, and passion, that is shown in this consummate love. And that consummate love is this idea of how you go out and, like, you're targeting that. You have all three of passion, intimacy, and commitment. And in that, how do you communicate that love and show that love to one another? It's how do I please you? Pleasing you is this idea of I love you, so I'm going to think of you first. Oh, remember when the author says that I'm going to consider you as better than myself? That's the waiter that sees to say, oh, you need some water? Let me fill it to you. That's how I get my Michelin star. When I give you water, even though it costs money every single time and they charge me for it, even though I didn't know, they keep filling it up. Ever had that situation happen? Someone spent $100 on water when I didn't mean to. Okay, what happened there? Marriage is an earthly endeavor. There's no marriage in heaven. So I want to put that in context. And then if there's no marriage in heaven, there's this idea of there's dealings of this in heavens, where it's like you deal with as world has no dealing, for this present form is passing away. And so even in the context of the Gospels, they describe that there is no marriage in heaven, that this is an earthly activity that is here and now, but is only for here and now. It's a glimpse, and it has a purpose, though. And if I was going to describe the purpose, that earthly marriage has a moment. It's a symbol. It's a symbol and a representation of our relationship in Christ and the church. It's this fulfillment of earthly purposes that God has for us, that he has a plan. He has something that we get a glimpse of, this idea of love and purpose and companionship. It also has this purpose in procreation. It's a focus on the divine, this idea, the fact that if there's no marriage in heaven, there's something that is to come, that our attention should be on the eternal or the divine. And there, in this context of marriage, while we're here, there's an aspect of great joy and fulfillment right here and now, okay? And that's a glimpse of what it is. And so there is an aspect where when we said, I don't know why today's shape of the day is triangles, but this idea of a triangle where your attention is on the king and the king himself. For some of us in this also context, the passage also talks about this idea of divorce. And divorce is not a way to honor really God's plan. Divorce shouldn't be the preferred option, but it does come up. And so he goes through this idea in the context of the unbelieving wife and the unbelieving husband, spouse, and what do you deal with that context? And so it may not be best to divorce an unbelieving spouse, but because that might be a way to be wholly devoted to God. That's not the point. But I would say that this idea is that when it comes to the idea of divorce, there is different types of views that people have when it comes to how they deal with divorce and what the passage of the multiple text says. Maybe you never initiated divorce, and sometimes you never remarry. Some choose to sometimes divorce and never remarry, sometimes divorce, some remarry, but there's context of that conviction. Why do I even share this? I'm going to share it in this way. Marriage is not a straight line. That's all I want to say. And then there's the ideal state of what you want. And it doesn't always work out the way you want. But you don't necessarily want to change your lot in life. Remember what I said earlier? Like whatever the situation that might come. And there might be legitimate context for that, unlegitimate context. But at the end of the day, it is not God's ideal or God's plan. Because God's plan is not your plan. Make sure it's clear. God's plan is not your plan. The bond slave wants to go change his lot in life. And some of you guys might feel stuck in your marriage or stuck in your situation. But that's not always the case. Or some of you guys might feel stuck. Well, I guess you can't be stuck in your home. Well, maybe after you go to college, you'll be fine. But you're stuck. Maybe stuck. What does that mean in that? How do you become faithful? How do you be faithful in that particular context? And in this thing, whether it be in the unbelieving spouse, Paul describes what that means in the context of unbelieving spouse, and he also talks about this idea of the bond slave. And in both of those contexts, he says, he just wants you to recognize that God's plan might not be your plan, but you have to be faithful in that context of their act. As I said earlier, not everyone has the choice of where they landed in their lot in life. Thankfully, in our time, you have some opportunity to choose your spouse. Some in that time did not even get to choose who they got to marry. Right? And they made it work. So you have to choose yourself to love. Choose yourself to stay. Choose yourself to work through it. So I'm going to give you those three things again. Number one, marriage is ministry. That's the first lesson. Marriage has a ministerial aspect that you put your relationship with God first, and serving your spouse serves God. Really. The act that I choose to honor God, it's going to sound even crazier, the act that I give to make love in and of itself glorifies God. Because I try to please my spouse. The act that I give to bring my water to a spouse, or because they need it, because I want to please them. I can devotionally do it for the glory of God, not just because what I want. That's my view. Some may disagree. Again, I feel like Paul now. My thought, not God's. But I do think it's from God, okay? For the glory of God, because in all that I do, as I minister to my spouse, I do it for the glory of God, illustrating a glimpse of love, illustrating on earth as it is in heaven. That's the first lesson. Second lesson, as you go from the up to the in, I want us to challenge that God's plan in marriage is not always there. Even with the expiration date that happens when it comes to marriage, even with the expiration date that God has made for you each to complete your work. In other words, the work that God has done in you and wants to do in you cannot be completed in that work until you have one another. I actually think that because of the ups and downs, it's the ups and downs and the trials that you work through and stick through that helps you become a better disciple in Jesus Christ. Because if you didn't, like, sometimes I always say, I love the fact if you're single, it's like I share the story about like, oh, I was such a good Christian when I didn't have to deal with people. I'll go to the library, read my Bible all day and all night. I'm like, I'd be like the best Christian. I wouldn't have to gossip. Wouldn't have to be angry. If I could just read my Bible in my library all day, all night. But that's not the point. And in the context of marriage, it helps you work through. And so I challenge us, the action is to persevere. Don't try to initiate your change of lot. Does it make sense? Like, I don't want to be the boss. I'm going to change my lot. I'm not going to initiate the divorce. I'm not going to initiate. I want to go ahead and work through to break through. And I know how hard it is for some of you. I've been in conversations with many of you on some of these topics, and you're like, how do I go through this? I'm like, persevere. I understand. It's not easy for me. It's not easy for you. But how do you persevere in the midst of that? And sometimes it doesn't work out. I understand that too. I know it sounds crazy. But you got to just carry that. And there's ups and downs, and we continue to do our best in the midst of the mistakes and the sin. And then for those of us in the outward expression, right here and now, ask yourself today, how do I please my spouse? Or is your focus on how do I please my kids? Or please my work, please my boss, please my ego? Because most of us are asking those questions. We're not asking this question. And even asking the question to the spouse. Because it's a choice to love. It's an action you take. It's not something you passively noun. I'm in love. It's a choice that you make, not with your feelings. It's a choice that you make every day to say, I'm going to find a way to please you. And find the ingredients of that passion. I know I failed because my way of trying to maybe sometimes to initiate love is to buy a gift, and that may not be the way that my wife experiences love, or vice versa for you. Right? You guys have to understand the language of what that might mean, or what it means to please, to show that oneness and that intimacy. Let's pray. God, we thank you for your word today. And although we've covered the text, in our time, I actually think there's still a ton of questions of how do we deal with relationships and marriage in our time. For those of us who are just entering into junior high, this is new. This is something. But I know pray that in the context of relationships, in the context of here and now, I pray that you'll give us view and perspective to recognize that there is a plan for the future. Those of us in high school, as we've tried to struggle and go through our life together and this idea of relationships, of what means and our identity of who we are, and all the different voices that come when it comes to relationships, sexuality, and intimacy, I pray that you would, the voices from that your voice would come through here and now from this text. For those of us in young adult season and singleness, I pray that they would enjoy this rich season of choice, of being able to, there's a desire to marry, but I pray that you would also embrace this particular season. Pray that for those of us who've been married or just going to be married, that you begin to give glimpses of what life together might look like, that it's not going to be all easy, but that you would allow for the tools in the earliest seasons to know that this person that they're going to marry will change as the years go by. And for those of us who've been married for a while, this person that we married is different than the one we married. So help us to grow and know that the things that might have made them happy or given them pleasure or given them joy are different today than they were then. So help us to ask those questions and seek out and renew our relationship, renew our love, and choose that as well. There's a lot to be said. And then we're kind of, not that the Greco-Roman time was worse or better, but we live in a season and in a world where the access to, and the voices that tell us what should be or shouldn't be, we just need your voice. So make it louder and clearer here and now. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. As Dolly leads us in a time of response, there's a couple things I want us to go do. I'm going to go ahead This is actually a very clear time where some of us, in the context of the last 3 sermons, one, Pastor Michael's sermon, if you haven't listened to it, go listen to it, or Pastor Chien's sermon on singleness, or this sermon today that summarizes, some of us have felt like we've kind of failed our spouses. And it's okay to confess that. Some of us have maybe failed in sexual sin, and you guys are going to admit that. Because again, self-control, we talked about that, it's really hard. And so as we come to the communion today and the communion table, usually, I don't know about you, but your confession is maybe one of those most important things. And I just want you to do so. The Bible teaches us. In the same book of Corinthians, says the same thing. And now he was betrayed, he took bread, he broke it, and said, this is my body broken for you. And basically said that all this brokenness, take it upon myself. Receive it. I want you to receive it and put it on me. And I want you to be freed and forgive. So that in the midst of all that shame and all that burden, all that pain, you put on me and you can come free and receive this with thanksgiving because now you can go out and renew that relationship and have the freedom in Christ to be loved, to be accepted. So today, as we have a time of response, both in song and communion song, we're going to leave it open for the next 2 songs, okay? I want you to take a moment to genuinely confess. Some of you might be confessed about your lot in life. Some might confess about a situation of like, it wasn't a straight line with your marriage or your marriage or whatever, like situations. And I want you to just confess and leave it and say, I want to make this season to go forward right. Okay? We'll go do that. And then if you're done confession, I want you to go take the elements. And when you take the elements and you go back to your seat, I know it sounds weird, but I want you to try to smile. You know why I want you to smile? Because I want you to practice the joy of that forgiveness. And that smile, you're like, why are you smiling? I don't know if you know why you're smiling. But if you're not smiling, then you're not thankful. Because usually when you're thankful, you're going to smile. And I want you to do that, okay? And so I invite you guys to take this time of communion. If you're a Christian and been baptized, I want you to come up and take the Lord's blessing here and now. Okay? Deacons, you come up, and if you could just come up and be prepared. We'll be here for a couple songs, and then after the second song ends, we'll pray. But let me pray for us. God, I just love the work you're doing here. Your Spirit's leading. May you convict our hearts of things that are right, things that are wrong. I also want to say, God, if there's certain things that are going right in our marriage, in our relationships, I pray our spouses will say it. I pray that we say it to one another to be a word of encouragement. Bring forth to mind the things that we need to confess and bring forth the minds that we're thankful for. Thank you. I leave this time of devotion in hands of my brothers and sisters.